What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back, everyone. This is Lee, and today we'll be talking about the Viltrox 40mm f2.5 lens versus the Nikon 40mm f2 lens. So with all that said, let's begin. So right before we get started, I just want to point out that Viltrox, they did send this lens over to me for evaluation. However, as usual, all opinions are my own opinions about the product. Also, the Nikon 40mm f2 lens, I picked that lens up myself just for this review. So with all that out the way, let's take a look at some specs. So the Nikon versus the Viltrox, let's first off talk about price. Now, the Viltrox comes in at 158 USD, whereas the Nikon comes in roughly around 300 USD, which is almost twice as expensive as the Viltrox. However, throughout this entire video, we'll definitely take a look at the image samples and see the lens performance between each lens. Now, let's take a look at some specs. The Nikon comes in roughly around f2, the highest aperture, whereas the Viltrox is 2.5. So we already see some benefits already on the Nikon. Also, the Nikon sports 9 blades, whereas the Viltrox sports 7 blades. They both use 52mm filter thread size for filters, and the Nikon has 6 elements, whereas the Viltrox, crazy enough, has 10 elements, which explains why the Viltrox is slightly longer than the Nikon. However, you take a look at the Nikon, it's slightly wider than the Viltrox. So just something for you guys to definitely take note of. Also, they both don't have image stabilization, and they both don't have weather seal, and they both come in with 1-year warranty. Now, let's take a look at the weight of these lenses. Now, right before we get into the weight, I just want to point this out. Viltrox, if you want to update the firmware, you need to go through the lens, whereas the Nikon, if you want to update the firmware, you need to go through the camera to update the lens. So just want to point that out. Now, let's take a look at the weight. The Nikon weighs about 167 grams, whereas the Viltrox weighs about 181 grams, and we know the additional grams is probably from the 10 elements that the Viltrox is offering. So I can't wait to see what that looks like, right? And also Viltrox, they offer a lens hood, which Nikon doesn't. So that's kind of a disappointment right there. However, I'll leave a link down below to this metal lens hood that will work for both brands. And this metal lens hood will allow you to attach another filter. So I'll leave a link down below for that if you guys are interested. But anyways, let's take a look at our first test. Now, here is the bokeh ball test. I'm gonna give you guys the floor and let you guys decide on your own which one do you guys actually prefer, because all honestly, this is very subjective, but if I have to critique this bokeh ball test, I would say that the bokeh ball on the Nikon is slightly bigger than the Viltrox, just because Viltrox has slight focus breathing. So I just want to point that out. Now, as for the next test, this is the bokeh blur test. I'm going to let you guys decide which bokeh blur is the best, because bokeh blur is very subjective. So with that said, definitely take a look at the bokeh blur and decide on your own which one fits your work the most. So there we go. Now, as for the next test, this is the distortion test, and I just want to point this out. Nikon has slightly more distortion than the Viltrox, but in the end, most of you guys are going to fix it in post or in the camera. So there we go. And as for this next test, this is the chromatic aberration test. I'm lighting up the scene with a 200 watt COB light at 100%. And throughout this entire aperture, I would have to say that around 2.0 throughout 4.0, the Nikon has slight chromatic aberration over the Viltrox. Now, if you take a closer look, I noticed that you render out more depth on the Viltrox over the Nikon. Nikon shows a bit more blur, whereas the Viltrox has a lot of depth when it comes to rendering out the scene. So just keep that in mind. And as for the next test, this is the flare test. I'm taking the same COB light at 200 watts that I used in my chromatic aberration test. I'm using this for the flare test. I'm beaming at the lens, and I can tell you throughout this entire test, Nikon handles the flare better than the Viltrox. And as for the next test, this is the minimum focus test. I think that this is kind of useless, but someone out there might find it useful. The Nikon minimum focus is about 11.4 versus the 12.4 on the Viltrox. So Nikon, you could actually get closer to your subject. So just want to point that out. And as for the next test, this is the vignetting test. And I just want to point this out. The Viltrox has more vignetting than the Nikon. Also, I do notice that the Viltrox is slightly wider than the Nikon, which tells me that it has slight focus breathing. So there we go. Now here is the sharpness test, and I am shooting outdoors on a cloudy day, and here is 2.0 versus 2.5. Already right off the bat, I can definitely tell you that the edges on the Nikon looks better than the Viltrox. 2.0 versus 2.5. Foreground looks more or less the same. On the right corner, looks like Nikon is slightly sharper than the Viltrox. Also, if you look at the background, the Viltrox is sharper than Nikon. Now for 2.5, even challenge right here, 2.5 versus 2.5, I would say that the background of the Viltrox is more sharper than the Nikon. Also still on the far left, I do notice that there's focus breathing, looks slightly wider on the Viltrox than the Nikon. Also slightly softer on the Viltrox on the corners versus the Viltrox. Viltrox corner seems to be slightly, bottom corner seems to be slightly softer. However, the background on the Viltrox looks much sharper. That is very interesting right there. At 2.8, it's more or less the same. The Viltrox background is sharper than the Nikon. However, Nikon edges, bottom edges is sharper than the Viltrox, as you can see. Also, foreground looks sharper on the Nikon. Also, bottom right looks more sharper on the Nikon versus the Viltrox. However, the background of the Viltrox looks sharper, crazy sharper at 2.8. Woo! Here is f4, and the center looks almost the same. I think that the Viltrox is slightly sharper in the background. On the bottom left, and yeah, I think, yeah, definitely Nikon is still sharper than the Viltrox. Foreground looks more or less the same. Bottom right looks sharper on the Nikon, but the background on the Viltrox, it looks slightly sharper than the Nikon. And as for 5.6, the background looks a bit even at this point. The left side of the Nikon seems to be slightly more sharper than the Viltrox. Foreground, crazy enough, foreground for the Viltrox, yeah, it looks overly sharp than the Nikon. However, on the right side, the Nikon is sharper than the Viltrox. And so, yeah, what a turn of events right here. And here is f8, and I would say that it's very much even at f8 for both lenses. Just try to ignore the vignetting for now. We will do some editing after this, but it's more or less the same sharpness at f8. And here is f11, and it's more or less the same actually. So yeah, it's kind of even at this point. Here is f16, and I will repeat this. It's very much more or less the same around f16. The edges, the bottom, the background, it all looks more or less the same in terms of sharpness and focus. So there we go. And as for this next test, I'm going to take the 2.5, which is the widest aperture on the Viltrox, and I'm going to take the 2.5 on the Nikon. I'm going to do some post-processing, removing the vignetting on both lenses, and also adjusting the exposure, trying to match both images to show you guys the clear difference between both brands. So this is at 100%. I would say that it's more or less the same on the edges just about, except the bottom corner seems to be slightly soft on the Viltrox. bottom right seems to be slightly sharper on the Nikon. And so this is with all the vignetting removed. Now you take a look at the background, you can clearly see that the Viltrox is sharper at 2.5 than Nikon at 2.5. Now, let's take a look at 300%. And there you go. This is 2.5 versus 2.5. And already right off the bat, Viltrox is extremely sharp than Nikon at 2.5. And look at the pole right here. Look at the box. Look at the text. Definitely the Viltrox is a bit more clearer than the Nikon at 2.5. And there we go. And as for this next test, this is the portrait test. I just wanted to make sure that you guys know that I did this. I actually nudged the Viltrox about 3 inches so it could compensate for the focus breathing. So here's 2.0 versus 2.5. And already right off the bat, I would say that the Viltrox is indeed slightly sharper than the Nikon. And if you take a look at the silhouette, definitely the Nikon is slightly softer on the edges. And here's f2.5. And again, if you take a look at the silhouette, the edges, the Nikon is indeed slightly softer than the Viltrox. And I would have to say, just by a little bit, Viltrox is slightly sharper than the Nikon, in my opinion. Here is f2.8. I would say that, yeah, my face on the Viltrox seems to be a little bit sharper than the Nikon. But this is very subtle, so just letting you guys know. And here is f4. I would say that the skin tone is definitely, of course, slightly different from one another. The Viltrox seems to be just a slight darker than the Nikon. Here is 5.6. Sharpness wise, looks more or less the same. It looks like I sat 4 on the Nikon, and Viltrox I leaned back, but overall, it looks more or less the same at this distance right here. And this is about perhaps 6 feet away from me, so just a little backstory. Here's f8, and I would say that in terms of sharpness, it looks more or less the same. Here is f11. And yes, I will have to say that it looks more or less the same. And here is f16. And again, it looks more or less the same in my opinion. In terms of sharpness, but color tones, it's definitely, Nikon seems to be a little bit slightly warmer, and Viltrox seems to be just slightly a little cooler, little slightly underexposed. So just wrap things up, the Nikon versus the Viltrox. Now, these are 2 different lenses for 2 different shooters, so let's break it down. If you're picking up the Nikon, you already know what you're getting, right? f2.0 over the 2.5, slightly better bokeh, also better autofocus and low light. Also, you're getting slightly sharper edges at the corners when you're doing landscape scenes. Also, it has better flare control and vignetting control on the lens. And if you're traveling a lot, it's actually a smaller package because the lens is a lot shorter than the Viltrox. So you get that pancake sized lens onto your system. Now, Viltrox, they're offering something that Nikon isn't offering. And that is number 1, better distortion control. Number 2, chromatic aberration control. Also, it comes with a lens hood and it's sharper than the Nikon. It is sharper than the Nikon. And that is crazy to think about because it's cheaper than the Nikon. So you pick up the Nikon, you're definitely paying a premium for it because it's not sharper than a cheaper lens. It's just kind of crazy right there. But if you need something compact, you get the Nikon obviously, and you're getting, you know, the actual autofocus and bokeh. So it really depends on these two shooters right here. So I'll leave that up to you guys. Now, I just want to point this out because there is something that I don't like about the Nikon when I did my test. If you take a look at this image, right, the font itself on the Nikon, it's crooked. I don't like the fact that they just skipped that part. It's just weird. I used to be the designer, that's why. So font typography is really important on a product and they really missed the mark on this one. So hopefully they start fixing these, like, I mean, it's probably an easy fix, right? They could just tweak the machines or whatever and print it on directly dead center. But I just want to point that out. But anyways, thank you guys for checking me back. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Definitely click like and subscribe. And I guess I'll see you guys in the next one, all right? Take it easy. Peace.